Hello and welcome to the final part of this four-part series on evaluation. I hope you have been benefiting from the last three parts. The first part essentially where we cover about what essentially is evaluation. So it gives you an idea of what evaluation is, as well as a some background in terms of how this whole process came about. Yeah. In the second part, where we look at what to look out for, I hope you remember to download and to grab that checklist. With that checklist itself, you'll be able to check against how you have been conducting evaluation and to see what are some gaps or what are some things that you might have missed out. And so that's in Practical Guide Part 2. And in Practical Guide Part 3, that's where we look at the 10 common mistakes. We break it down into the three broad areas and what you can do and what you can avoid, how you can avoid them. So grab that cheat sheet. Grab that cheat sheet in terms of that 10 common mistakes and see what are some things that you could do. What are some common mistakes, and do you make those common mistakes? And if you do, how you are able to avoid them and to address them. Last one is in this part here, we're looking at what's next after evaluation. So after you have gone through the whole process of doing an evaluation, what's next? Yeah, so again, be sure to grab that checklist at the end of this segment so that you're able to say that, okay, after I've done my evaluation, have I looked into all these different areas? So this would be a useful guide and a useful practical guide for you. So what's next? After evaluation, one of the key things that you do is look at areas for improvements. Now, remember, in this whole process itself, the whole purpose of evaluation is to help us identify good practices, as well as to help us to identify gaps so that we can move to the next level. So when you identify the good or best practices that ensure that the organization is sustainable, yeah, and when you look at areas for improvements and when you're able to successfully implement those areas for improvement, that will lead your organization to the next level. So that's the whole purpose of evaluation itself. So when we look at areas for improvement, there are some key things that you want to look out for. And to avoid doing it in a haphazard manner, we've put out a four-step process for you to think of. Something like a checklist in itself, four things to look at when you are looking at improvement. The first one, what I would like to encourage you to do is to ask yourself, how can we enhance the results here? Now, when you talk about results, we are not just looking at KPIs, or we're not just looking at targets itself, but we're looking at results. We're looking at three broad things. Number one is we're looking at the objective. So at the for every program process or even a plan approach, there must be objective or objectives. Yeah, and so the first thing is to look at when you look at result is, of course, the objectives or the goals, if you like. Yeah, the second thing that you need to look at in terms of results other than objectives would be the performance indicators or the indicators. Yeah, so these indicators may be key, as in KPIs, or just performance indicators. Okay, so here largely the indicators will be performance indicators, not activity indicators, because activity indicators are meant to monitor implementation. Whereas when we're talking about results here, we are looking at performance. So performance indicators. So first one, objective. Second one's the indicators. And the third one is targets. So how do you set targets? For example, do you go by arbitrary 5% every year in terms of improvement, or is there a methodology that you use, or is there a basis that you use when you set targets, for example? So all this gives you an opportunity to say that, okay, is there a better way for us to refine the way we craft our objectives or our goals? Let me give you an example here. So for instance, when you are writing an objectives, some of the key thing is to take note, are there specific items or specific behavioral change that you want to see in terms of the objectives? So for example, if you put in place a program there must be some objective, and the objective sometimes could be a behavioral change, sometimes could be an outcome change. All right, so an objectives, can you craft it in a better way so that it's clearer to everybody? When you look at indicators, is there a better way of identifying indicators to measure the objectives? And lastly, of course, the target. So how do you enhance the results? Next, you would also want to ask yourself, is there a way that we can refine or improve our plan approach? Recall in the first part of this four-part guide, we gave you a synopsis and as well as an overview of the single loop and the double loop learning model. If you haven't reviewed part one of this practical guide, I strongly encourage you to do that, because that gives you the background and the context of why we look at evaluation and what kind of surrounds it. So we're saying that with every approach that you have, therein come with a series of assumptions or hypotheses. So with this evaluation itself, you want to ask yourself, in terms of approach, are there certain assumptions that are still valid and certain assumptions that are not? When I work with schools, one of the things that I found to be really useful when we're talking about the approach here is that, do you have some kind of a philosophy or guiding principle or a set of practices that determine the approach that you would take? So once again, is there some form of philosophy, guiding principles, or practices that kind of help you in terms of your approaches? Yeah, so that would be the approach. And third one is you also want to ensure that the deployment is effective. So in the first part where we talk about results, we talked about performance indicators. Here, when you talk about deployment, you would want to be looking at activity indicators. Yeah, so when you're looking at activity indicators, it will kind of enable you to tell you whether your deployment has been effective. So you want to say, okay, is there a better way to deploy? Is this the most effective way? Is this the most efficient way, for example? So is this better to do it 2 times a week or 2 times a month? Yeah, is it easy? Is it better to do it in the morning or in the afternoon? So all these fall under the category of deployment itself. And finally, is there a possibility for us to enhance the evaluation process? So for example, in the past, you may be using an after action review for everything, for program evaluation, for process evaluation, for plan approach evaluation. And now, having known that, you might know that, hey, that might not be so adequate. And so as a result of that, you may say that, well, what I need to do is I need to enhance my evaluation process. So perhaps at a program level, I will still use an after action review. But for a process, maybe I'll use the single loop and the double loop. And for a plan approach, maybe I'll use a radar logic or a logic model, for example. Yeah, so this will be the different ways when you look at improvements. So I strongly encourage you to use this as a checklist or a cheat sheet to kind of help you look at improvements after you have conducted your evaluation. Now, before we go, I just want to say a few words about the different types of improvements, and I think this is critical for you to take note. There are essentially 2 types of improvements. The first one is what we call incremental improvements. Now, incremental improvements are, in a way, it's like natural progression. So if you make certain, if your processes are well in place, well established, well oiled, along the way you should see incremental improvements. Yeah, so these incremental improvements may be small, but if you stack them up over a period of time, these improvements can be quite big. Okay, so one way to look at it is that if your improvements are within that range of about 5%, those are usually what we term as incremental improvements. Okay, now typically incremental improvements come as a result of change in terms of implementation or change in terms of behavior. What do we mean by that? For example, when you look at incremental improvements, these are usually a result of some changes in the implementation or deployment. So, for example, changing from a 2 times a week format to a 3 times a week format leads you to an improvement in terms of results. Yeah, and this small tweaks sometimes usually would give you incremental improvements. Of course, I am not also discounting the fact that sometimes small tweaks in some of the deployment can give you a breakthrough, but more often than not, small tweaks in implementation in deployment usually brings about an incremental improvement. So that's type number one. Type number two, it's a little bit more interesting in the sense that we are looking at breakthrough improvements. So if you recall back to the model, the process flow that we showed you, where we look at evaluation, we say that if you want to make incremental improvements, you change your deployment. If you want to see a breakthrough improvement, you change your approach. So this is akin to what, this is essentially paraphrasing what Stephen Covey said. If you want to make incremental improvement, you change behavior. If you want to see a breakthrough, you change mindset, you change paradigm. So in order for us to have a breakthrough, sometimes it can come from internal, because that could be internal institutional knowledge, and people have been looking at it, analyzing it for the longest time, and finally they see a breakthrough. Yeah, they have a shift in terms of a mindset, and a breakthrough happens. Very often, in most cases, what we have seen is that breakthrough improvement comes as a result of two possibilities. Possibility number one is adaptation of best practices from other industry, or even from same industry competitors. Yeah, so point number one is a breakthrough typically can come from adaptation of best practices. So whether those best practices are from the same industry or from another industry, that's irrelevant, or that's not the case. No, that's not the thing here. But the thing here is that there is the adaptation of best practices. Now, another possibility of breakthrough could result from innovation. Yeah, innovation essentially sometimes requires a shift in terms of mindset, and as a result of that, you have a breakthrough. And if I could add a third one could be breakthrough improvements. Sometimes can come from literature review. So research can sometimes give you an added impetus or added insight in terms of how you can shift in the way that we do things. So remember, when you look at incremental improvements, typically these are aligned to changes in terms of deployment. When you look at breakthrough, these are typically changes that are done at the plan approach level. Okay. Now, so in summary, these are the three key things that you want to look at. What's next after evaluation? You want to ask yourself, can I improve in the way that I write my goals, my objective, my indicators, my targets? Can I improve my plan approach or effectiveness of my implementation, or even my evaluation process? Yeah. And then the other thing you want to take note is the different types of improvements, incremental improvements, which is tied to changes in terms of deployment typically, and breakthrough improvements, which are tied typically to plan approach improvements. And finally, identifying improvements, you want to take note of this. Identifying improvements need to be a structured approach as well. In other words, it cannot be haphazard or opportunistic. Or just because I attended a meeting last week and someone said this, and hence I recorded this as an improvement, that would be kind of one-off, opportunistic, and not sustainable. So the key thing here is we want to have a structured approach so that it can be sustainable, it can be replicated. So some of the sources of improvements can of course come from internal, tapping on institutional knowledge. Existing knowledge that the people have is really critical and important. But sometimes we also need to look outside. So outside could be looking at competitors, comparable schools, or it can also be looking at best practices from other industries as well. And finally, not also forgetting that tapping into research might be one big area that you could look at in terms of improvements. Okay, so there you have it. This is the part in this 4-part practical guide for evaluation. I hope it has greatly benefited you. Do remember to grab the checklist and the cheat sheet for each of this part of the practical guide. So at least you can kind of help you determine whether at the way that you're doing evaluation, how you're doing it, are there certain gaps and how you can plug those gaps, for example. Yeah. And as always, if you have a question for me, feel free to jump in on the use the recording software and send me a question. And I'll be more than glad to see how best I could either incorporate your question in future episodes or future practical guides, or I could perhaps, if it's pressing enough, I could reply to you via email, for example. And once again, if you're listening to this recording or this audio file independently outside of our website, please go ahead to our website at lineconsulting.com. That is lineconsulting.com, one word. Lineconsulting, one word.com. And sign up at no charge to get this 4 parts practical guide, as well as future webinars that we will be conducting from time to time, and of course to use the recording software to ask me a question. All right. And so once again, thank you so much for your attention, your time, and your interest in this 4-part practical guide. I hope this has been useful. Give us some feedback. We'd like to hear from you what you think, what's good, what's not good, what could be better, what else you're looking out for in terms of evaluation, and we'll see how we can help you along the way. All right. Thank you. And this is Melvin Tan signing off.